Before looking at the impact of changes in the variables that make up the expenditure model of GDP, it might be useful to take a minute to look at what economists call leakages and injections. First, let's look at leakages. Leakages are anything that reduces GDP. Some common leakages from the economy are saving, money that's stored for future use; taxes, money sent to the government; and imports, goods brought into the country from another country, and the money for them sent out. Injections are anything that increases GDP. Things like investment, money spent on capital goods; government spending, money spent on public goods; exports, goods being sold to foreigners, and the money brought into the country. If the economy is equilibrium, savings should equal investment, because ideally savings are being channeled through the financial system into business for investments. If the economy is in equilibrium, taxes should equal government spending. If the economy is in equilibrium, then the amount imported should equal the amount of the goods exported. If the sum of the leakages, savings, taxes, and imports is greater than the sum of injections, investment, government spending, and exports, there's a downward pressure on real GDP, because more money is being taken out of the economy than is going into it. If the sum of the leakages, savings, taxes, and imports is less than the sum of injections, investment, government spending, then there is an upward pressure on real GDP, because more money is being put into the economy than is going out of it. As you may remember, aggregate expenditure is equal to consumption, C, plus investment, I, plus government spending, G, plus net exports. Or you might remember that there are three components to aggregate demand, which is the same thing as aggregate expenditures. Consumption is abbreviated with the letter C, investment is abbreviated with the letter I, government spending is abbreviated with the letter G, net exports, the difference between exports and imports, is abbreviated with the letter X. So what happens when autonomous consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports changes? If there is additional spending by government, business, or the foreign sector, there will be an increase in real GDP. If there is less spending by business, government, or the foreign sector, there will be a decrease in real GDP. Remember that the marginal propensity to consume controls how much additional money is put into the economy. Autonomous investment refers to the amount of investment that takes place regardless of the interest rate, expected profit from selling more product, or the level of GDP. In the future lecture, we'll look at what happens when these things, like the interest rate or the expected profit from selling more of the product, or the optimal level of GDP, changes. Let's take a minute to see what happens to GDP and consumption when firms decide to increase their investment. First, let's review the situation before the firms make this decision. The current GDP is $500 and the current consumption is $450. The CEOs of all the firms in the country decide to increase their investment because they feel like it's a good idea. This decision is an autonomous increase in investment, and will cause the consumption function to shift upwards, in our example by $100. The result of this increased investment is to cause GDP to increase by $325 to $825. Autonomous spending by the government occurs when the government decides to spend some additional revenue. The amount of expenditures is determined by the political process. Let's see what happens when the government increases its spending. When the government increases its spending, it is purchasing additional goods and services, so its autonomous consumption increases. Remember that the starting GDP is $500. In our example, the government will increase spending by $175. The additional spending caused the consumption curve to shift upwards, Notice that the orange colored line shifts upward and crosses the C equal Y at point A. If the line is drawn from A to the income axis, the new GDP is $1,100. So, as a result of an increase of government spending by $175, the GDP of the country increases by $600 in our example. Now let's see what happens when the government raises taxes by $50. An increase in taxes means that individual consumers now have less money to spend. For example, if an individual takes home $650 and the government raises taxes by $50, then that individual has only $600 to consume per week. The government has decreased the consumption of the individual because the individual now has less money to use to consume things with. Since the individual has less money for consumption, the consumption function will shift downward. Once the consumption function has shifted downward, it will cross the C equal Y line at point A. If a line is drawn from point A to the income axis, the new GDP is $100. Thus, an increase in taxes causes the consumption function to shift downward and GDP will decrease, in this case by $400. Let's see what happens when there are autonomous changes in net exports. First, let's take a moment to review the definitions of exports, imports, and net exports. Exports are sold by a country to foreign countries. For example, if the U.S. sells cars to Russia, the cars are exports and the U.S. receives money from Russia. Imports are goods sold by foreigners to a country. For example, if Russia sells oil to the U.S., the oil is an import to the U.S. and Russia receives the money from the U.S. Net exports is the difference between exports and imports, or exports minus imports. Let's see what happens when exports increase. Remember that the starting GDP is $500. An increase in exports will cause the consumption function to shift upward because foreigners will be purchasing more goods from a particular country. The reason for the shift upward is that the country receives money from the other countries, and this increases the income of those individuals living in the country. Notice that the consumption function crosses the C equal Y at point A on the graph. If a line is drawn from point A to the income axis, a new GDP of $1,200 appears. So as a result of an increase in imports by $200, the consumption function shifts upward and GDP increases by $700. Let's see what happens when imports increase. Remember that the starting GDP is $500. An increase in imports will cause the consumption function to shift downward because the country will purchase more goods from foreigners. The reason for the shift downward is the country sends money out to other countries, and this increases the income of those countries. Notice that the consumption function crosses the C equal Y at a new point A. If a line is drawn from point A down to the income axis, the new GDP is $200. So, as a result of an increase in imports, the consumption function shifts downward and GDP decreases, in this example by $300.